The Spinoff Podcast Network. Skinny are helping you show how smart you are with the 1Q quiz, an all-new, super challenging and super quick daily quiz built by the Spinoff. Every Monday, Skinny are giving you the chance to prove you're smart with the Skinny Extra Credit question. Get it right, and you'll get the chance to score yourself some Skinny Extra mobile credit, so you can text, call, or even video call your group chat and gloat about how big your brain is. T's and C's apply.
The Fold is brought to you by oMedia, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Nau mai hoki mai ki a The Fold, e mihi nei ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guest today might appear unconventional, but I'm going to explain it and I think land it. His name's Kit Arkwright. He is the CEO of Beef and Lamb New Zealand. Beef and Lamb are a client of the Spinoffs. That's how I've got to know Kit, and we've had versions of this conversation just over the past kind of year or so, and it's just always seemed like there is a knottiness and complexity to it that I don't often see recognized in how we talk about those, about beef and lamb and agriculture in New Zealand. I've always felt like it feels reductive and binary, the way the conversation typically happens. And I wanted to do something that felt like it wasn't in that realm, that it did kind of sit with the complexities of this topic, because beef and lamb isn't alone. We have dairy, we have wine, we have beer, we have huge chunks of New Zealand's economy, society that has positive and negative externalities, that makes contributions to our socio-cultural life while having problems around health or climate or misuse. This is, and none of us planning on quitting these things tomorrow, while also having to think about how we kind of deal with those externalities around climate, around environment, around health. And I just always enjoyed the conversation with Kit, because we're so often, and I think this can be true of these kind of umbrella organizations generally, they very frequently will shy away from or just sort of outright dismiss any critique of or anything which kind of strays from just a purely positive, optimistic mindset around their product. And Kit's not at all like that. And I remember a few years ago, this was just like a story that kind of really killed me, was when I think Air New Zealand was maybe just doing a little kind of fun publicity run with Impossible or Beyond Meat in business class or something, and a New Zealand First MP just got incredibly excited and accused the airline of going woke or something, and that is just very often the kind of knee-jerk. You see it a bit from Federated Farmers, to be fair. Anywhere where any kind of issue is automatically becomes kind of like a culture war issue, or something that you can only unambiguously support, otherwise you're sort of the enemy, and you're almost the enemy, you're almost like a traitor. And that's just not, to me, how you have a grown-up discussion. So I wanted to have Kit on to talk about how an organization like his addresses the concerns around it and tries to weigh the complexities, the sort of things that are hard about it, with the positive things, the cultural, the health elements that you're ultimately trying to weigh in both hands and see, well, what is the holistic contribution of this thing to New Zealand society? Because let's face it, and this is a thing sometimes I think parts of our readership don't address, is like, you can't just turn this off tomorrow. Like, you do that and we starve, or we can't afford to do almost anything, because it's just that significant contribution to our employment, to our tax base, to our to just how we survive from a nutritional perspective. So while there is a downward trend in terms of the total meat consumed per capita, this stuff has to be done it is a transition we're going through here if we're going to get to 2050. So, and of all the people I've spoken to who kind of sit at the nexus of some of these challenges, Kit is one of the most open and even-handed and genuinely curious versions of that, and so I've had him on the fold on International Land Day just because it's kind of a cute hook to talk about the complexities of his job and what beef and lamb is for New Zealand and how you communicate that in an environment that really isn't, in the social media era, particularly up for a complicated conversation. So hopefully, I certainly got a shitload out of it. I hope you do too as an audience. This is Kit Arkwright, the CEO of Beef and Lamb, on the fold. Tēnā Kit, welcome to the fold.
Thank you for having me on.
So I wonder if you could start by, you're not from around here originally, and yet you lead this organisation that has quite a deep connection to this country's history. I just wondered if you could tell me how you came to be in this job.
Yeah, why is a POM leading Beef and Lamb New Zealand?
Unbelievable.
Look, fairly, just really a story of good luck, to be honest. I came over here. It was a journey of romance. I was following my partner. I came over unemployed and had been unemployed for about 2 or 3 months at the point of arriving in New Zealand, and actually did a waitering job for my mother-in-law, who I was living with at the time. At the house of my predecessor and of my current role, a gentleman called Rod Slater. 2 or 3 days later, I saw Beef and Lamb were advertising a marketing role, and I thought, sounds pretty good to me. Went for the job and came into a marketing role, and then, what have I been, just over 6 years now, opportunities presented itself to me, and about 2.5 years ago, that one of those opportunities was the CEO role. So here I am.
That was a pretty fortuitous side hustle.
Yeah.
So what's the backstory of the organisation? How did it come to be, and what does its sort of function?
Yeah, the function on paper is the domestic marketing body for the red meat sector. So we're representing farmers, processors and retailers. How it came into existence, it was an retail organisation initially in the 1980s, and there to very similar purpose. And then in the late 90s, with the establishment of the quality mark, which you may know is the mark that will sit on packs of meat, that brought in farmer contingent and the processor contingent, and that's really taken us through to where we are today. Of course, there's what I'd like to call some pretty iconic marketing campaigns, advertising campaigns that have been there in the past with the Ever Swindells and the Olympic athletes. But yeah, the purpose and the remit is more or less the same as it was in the 1980s. But of course, there's a slightly different environment now in which to operate. Yeah,
and I'm kind of quite curious to dig into that, because that sort of seems like what's most sort of interesting and potentially challenging about the role now. But you described those groups of stakeholders who are, run from corporations to extremely rural people. Is it difficult trying to cohere a strategy and marketing out of a very diverse group of people inputting?
Yeah, definitely. Look, you've got I think we believe our setup is unique in the world, in that there are similar organisations to us around the world that fulfil a similar function, but they're usually only representing maybe the farmer group or whatever, and so I think we are unique in that sense. But I think it's also our biggest strength. We have everyone sitting, that full supply chain sitting around the table with us. That naturally causes some challenges sometimes, but I think it's also our biggest strength. We are here representing the whole supply chain, and I try to hold at the heart of the philosophy of the organisation is what do I think is best for the whole supply chain, not what might be best for farmers or processors or retailers, but how do we present the product to Kiwi consumers in the best possible light.
I hope I'm not being overly reductive here when I say that I can imagine that marketing beef and lamb, in the early days of the organisation was a relatively simple exercise, in that this was a product that was kind of unambiguously part of our national story, part of our national diet, and viewed relatively uncritically within that context. And we're going to get into this as we go through the podcast, but that has become successively more complex over the last decade. Do you want to just talk through, because that's also spanned your whole time with the organisation, how that exercise has and how the remit has changed in your time with the organisation?
I think has the job of marketing beef and lamb changed? The product's more or less the same. The reasons people purchase it, taste, enjoyment, health reasons, the ability to bring friends and family together. So I think, really from a positive standpoint, the story's still very much the same, and we lean into the same messages that my predecessors will have done over many years. Look, I think in terms of perhaps the more scrutiny side of the equation, it has certainly risen, and I think that's come from really a growing appetite from consumers to understand where their food comes from, how it's produced. And look, with that comes for an organisation does it cause some challenges? Absolutely, but I think it's welcome, that people want to understand how their food produced. And, and if we can fulfil a role in helping them to understand, then brilliant, bring it on.
So one of the, we'll get to some of the sort of specific challenges that you're referring to there, but one of those is around consumption and the frequency of it. And if you think about the sort of an idealised or quintessential New Zealand diet of the 70s, would have had red meat at its core probably throughout the year, or certainly every day, and for reasons as varied as the different cultural makeup of New Zealand to kind of health and environmental and climatic concerns. What does the data tell you about the changing kind of consumption patterns of New Zealanders as it relates to beef and lamb?
The longitudinal trends absolutely show that we're eating less meat now. And then you've just touched on some of the reasons there. I think probably one of the biggest reasons in that is the choice we have available to us. We have, we are lucky enough in New Zealand that we have we walk into a supermarket and you have got all sorts of different, and let's talk protein here. There is, of course, the traditional animal proteins and the, you look over maybe the last 15, 20 years and the price of chicken, which has come down considerably in the role that, that's probably taken in terms of volumes, but also, other plant-based forms of protein that have come in. And I think that's created choice and people have enjoyed that and lent into that. I think we are eating less, and for me, I think it's what I hope is that when a Kiwi, I always think about that moment when you cooked a leg of lamb and you spent quite a lot of time stressing over it, and you cut into it and you see that pink blushing meat at you, and you go, yes, I've nailed it, and that excitement and enjoyment and that anticipation, and maybe you've got some friends and family. I think as long as Kiwis get that same feeling, which I think they do, or you're cutting into that sirloin steak and there's that perhaps darker red, your mouth starts watering. I think for me, as long as people are feeling like that when they eat the product, whether they're eating vast quantities or whether they're eating more moderate quantities, that's what we're hoping to elicit out of them. So, I think, we can spend a lot of time looking at consumption, but I think it's about, people feeling positive about when they eat it.
Well, one of the things that, I've this is not the first time we've talked by any means, and one of the things I've always kind of enjoyed about our conversations is the sense that where there are sort of trade organisations, of which beef and lamb is a variety, that have a kind of a complex communication ecosystem or set of challenges, there are two approaches to take. One is you front the thing head on, and one is that you sort of put your head in the sand. I remember a few years ago, and I think Air New Zealand was talking about having some kind of, vegetarian meats on flights, and there was just this kind of amazing, quite hilarious furore around it, sort of led by, I think, New Zealand First at the time, which is an approach, but I don't think it's a particularly sustainable one, whereas yours is very much, and this is what I like about it, is we can dig into the complexities and the sort of trade-offs that are associated with your particular product, which exist in wine and in dairy and all kinds of other things that are very intrinsic to the New Zealand psyche and to our economy as well. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time kind of drilling into that, because I do think that you're, I like the way that you're very sort of open for that conversation. So there are, I'd like to kind of look at whether it's critiques or just the sort of challenges to red meat, and which fall into sort of three main buckets, and we can sort of address them in turn. There was or is a sense that farming, and particularly the farming of cattle, has a negative impact on the physical environment. And I know that's something that Fonterra, for example, has put a lot of work and energy into. What is the kind of current state of, how do you address that? Let's put it that way.
There's a growing concern, and justified concern, that people have around the impacts of food production. Now, of course, livestock are high profile in that sense, but there is no perfect food production that leaves no impact. You're ultimately putting something in the ground. You're hoping it grows. It goes energy inputs into that, and you take it away. And
we all got excited about almond milk, and then until we found out about the water consumption habits. This stuff is complicated, and humans, unfortunately, we've got negative externalities.
Exactly, and I think for me, as a sector, we acknowledge those challenges, and whilst I'm personally not at the coalface of addressing those challenges, what I can see and what I see from farmers is a genuine desire to farm in a better way. And there are no silver bullets. We can't just pull one lever somewhere and think, right, that'll do it all. It's really that game of those marginal gains that we try and find. But look, I think, regardless of the challenges that we face in the physical environment or the climatic environment, I think we've got a great story to tell in terms of the progress, and it's a humble journey that we're on as a sector. We're using 4 million hectares less of land, but producing more or less the same volume of meat. We are, as sheep and beef farmers, they are custodians of about 24% of all New Zealand's native bush. So you think that's a huge responsibility for farmers. And so what I'd say is, what I always would encourage is, when we start to talk about the more pointy end, the policy end, et cetera, and again, that is not my area. I would encourage you to speak to others if you wanted to get into that. But, given that sense of responsibility on farmers to protect native bush, the biodiversity that comes with that, let's create a framework and an environment, a regulatory framework that allows them to excel in that, rather than, I suppose, you could the opposite would be more blunt, in terms of the levers that could be pulled in that space.
So another, I guess, concern, and this kind of is related on some level, not just around choice, but around the sort of health aspects of it, that there's a kind of concerns about whether it's a sort of carcinogen in particular qualities. There's this movement towards less but better meat and so on. Which again is a big change from that's kind of quintessential New Zealand diet that we referred to earlier. What is the kind of the response of the organisation to concerns about what it does to those who consume it? Yeah,
all right. The first point of this I'm going to address is the C word, carcinogenic, and I think there has been a lot of scaremongering that goes on around this link, and I think it's really important that when we talk about these aspects of food consumption, that we're really clear on the science here, and that is that there has been no causational link established between consumption of red meat and cancer. There are correlations, and we can look You can go into that, but there are correlations. But I repeat, there has been no causational link established between red meat consumption and cancer. And I think that this is often what gets lost in the headlines of media coverage. And I think I would, and this is why this opportunity to come and talk to you today gives me the opportunity to kind of explore in a little bit more detail than, the traditional headline. But, you look at the World Health Organization, World Cancer Research Fund, even the Ministry of Health here in New Zealand, they all have looked at the body of evidence about the role that red meat can play in a diet when you eat it modest levels. And it can have really positive impacts on people's lives or health. And one of I think the best sort of visual examples, and you might remember our old ads with a massive pile of spinach or silver beet. They were comparison ads. So there was the shot started on a pile of spinach.
Yes.
And then it zooms out and there was a tiny bit of sirloin steak next to it. And I think that is the embodiment of what red meat plays. It is it's the nutrient-dense ability to deliver a huge amount of essential nutrients. Yes, it's a protein as a macronutrient, but you've got iron, zinc, B12, all really essential to your health and well-being. And so just to track back to the carcinogenic aspect of it, we've got to look at, when you look at the risk factors around carcinogens, it's your overall lifestyle. What you got a piece of meat there, but how have you cooked it? What's keeping it company on the plate? Is it chips or whatever, or is it a beautiful veg? And, how much exercise are you doing? How much alcohol are you drinking? Are you smoking cigarettes? All those types of things factor into...
both also carcinogens, obviously, notoriously.
Of course.
Yeah.
There is a huge number of factors that actually determine your risk profile around cancer. And I think it's a real red herring to then focus in on individual foods. I'm actually going to borrow something from a food writer here in New Zealand, Nikki Bezant, said once in an article, which is, I hope I'm getting this right, but let's move away from people telling people what not to eat. And let's just start talking about what they should eat. Or, and if you're looking at that from a personal perspective, rather than thinking about what you should be excluding from your diet, let's think about what you should be including. If you're quite partial to a biscuit at 3:00 in the afternoon, can you switch to some fruit, some apple? And actually by making thinking about it, those positive changes, I think it fills you up and you're not thinking about the biscuit anymore. And I think that's what I would encourage all dialogue around health and nutrition is, let's not get binary around good or bad. Everything can play a role, in particular with red meat, given the nutrient density of the product, the ability to deliver bang for buck nutrients. Let's not be demonizing that with very loosely correlated associations with cancer. And I think the other thing that there is that rational or the health side of things, but I think there's also the social side that food and meat in particular can play. I'm British, and the Sunday roast is a huge part of our culture. But that ability for a leg of lamb, and you say to your family, "Look, I'm cooking a leg of lamb." You've got the kids coming home or whatever it is. That I think is also something that shouldn't be forgotten. Whether you want to call that social or the cultural relevance to meat has to people in New Zealand and across cultures across the world. And so, I think there's a huge amount of good that comes from eating meat, health-wise, and socially. That we, let's move out of the binary and into just more of a holistic view. And probably a really good indication that actually our diets haven't changed. There was some research out from the Ministry of Health. 2022, I think, late 2022, that it was an eating habits survey. 92.8% of adult Kiwis are eating red meat at least weekly, and that goes up to 94.7% for children. So that tells to me that the vast majority of Kiwis, they like the taste, they like how it makes them feel, and they like how it fuels them and their family, whether that be at work, at school, on the sports field, whatever. And you've heard a lot of, we're all going to go vegan. We're not. We still have a love affair with red meat here in New Zealand.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of, I don't know if listeners are subscribers to the Boil Up, our food newsletter, that sort of trying to acknowledge and live with the complexities of the sort of cultural, social, political, environmental aspects of food consumption and meat consumption is something that Charlotte Muri Lanning, the previous editor of it, explored quite frequently within there. So I totally take your point there, especially in, as you say, an increasingly diverse New Zealand society. The final issue, and this one is probably the most present in it's in the current conversation, and it gets into what I want to talk about next, which is in the sort of complex entanglement that we have between our sort of national interest, our nutrition interest, and our sort of, and our climate goals, I guess, as a society, because these are all unavoidably bundled here. So, do you want to talk about that climate story?
Yeah, and look, it's let's acknowledge that is it 49% of New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions come from from agriculture, not of which a portion is livestock. So it's really understandable that of course, our sector in particular is in the spotlight on that. Again, there are no silver bullets. I think farmers again recognise their role. They're right on the firing line. When there are major climatic events that are coming, which it feels like they're happening more and more and more, whether it's a flood or it's a drought, they're right on the front line of the impact of that. And again, I would stress the point that I suppose the question I'd ask is, when you think of Ilse Farmer, what do you think of?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a in my mind, and this is probably totally antiquated. It's this sort of Barry Crump-like figure from a Hilux ad of forever ago. But yeah, what has that changed? What's the kind of modern reality there?
Well, you're probably thinking more of the physical. Mine's more, but I see a mirror. I see probably a parent. I see someone who is probably trying to service a mortgage or quite a lot of business debt, and who wants to hand on the world, their environment, their farm, their whatever, to their children, their next generation, in ideally a better condition than they found it. How they do that, and whether we're talking about emissions or whether we're talking about the physical environment, biodiversity, water quality, etc., there's very few simple solutions to that. And, again, blunt levers that could be pulled. And of course, in particular, emissions have been a very topical discussion around how do we address that. But let's look at the stats. Since 1990, emissions have gone from sheep and beef have gone down 30% since 1990. Now, does that mean the job's done? No. Does that mean that we'll find an extra 50% lying or 20% reduction lying under the sofa cushions? No. We're going to have to keep working hard. We're going to have to keep developing technologies and keep talking about solutions. But I think, again, I want to stress there is recognition from the sector and from farmers that we've got to keep going on that journey. And, again, it comes, if we're talking about in a communication setting, let's have good faith discussions around that and what that means and how do we get there together as a country and and our role as an industry within that country.
The Fold is brought to you by O-Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to O-Media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
I mean, ultimately, all this comes back to a sense that there is, and when you describe the the percentages of people in New Zealand who eat meat, it does make it clear that it is a passionate and really, we have to admit, like super well-intentioned minority who find the national diet and the kind of role of agriculture in our economy and our diet, problematic. But there's an argument that I've heard and read that always struck me as quite compelling that I'd like you to sort of address, which is that, we live in a globalized economy. As much as we have domestic consumption of beef and lamb, we export a huge amount of it. And we'll talk a bit more about the economic aspect of it shortly. But these are markets. And were we to overnight drastically reduce or completely curtail our production of beef and lamb, it's going to be substituted by beef and lamb from somewhere else because the global demand and the global supply are just simply at that scale, and no one else is moving to kind of make radical reductions, particularly in the face of the sort of just the scale of demand for it. There has been this case made that, yes, New Zealand's emissions profile is heavily influenced by the role of agriculture in our society and economy, but that on a sort of per kilogram basis, New Zealand's beef and lamb is relatively lower impact than from other parts of the world simply because of how it is made and our general ecology, our climate and so on. Is that accurate? Because if so, I do think it is just obviously a more complex question than just turning it off, because you can turn it off here, pat yourself on the back, feel better about it, while also making the world worse off.
Yeah, you've probably pulled a lot of my talking points out of my notes there.
It's just you have to have a grown-up conversation about that. You can't pretend that that's not real.
Yeah, look, and in terms of, if we're talking emissions here, and the industry commissioned a life cycle analysis a couple of years ago now, of which we came to you guys, the Spinoff, and said, help us explain this science to your readership. But what that research told us was we are amongst the lowest carbon footprint per kg in the world. And, for sheep meat in particular, based on that research, we're more or less carbon neutral. And so if you give that, and I always think these are a bit misleading, but everyone else does it, so I think I'll do it here today as well, is if you eat to the guidelines, so that's about, this Ministry of Health guidelines is about 500 grams cooked per week. Don't know why they put it like that, because no one puts it back on the scale after they cook it, but that translates to about 700 to 750 grams raw. If you ate to those guidelines, the annual emissions based on this LCA research for an average person is less than a return flight from Auckland to Queenstown for over a year. And so
over a year, not on a per meal.
Not per meal. No, over a year. Sorry, I should have been clear on that. We're absolutely, and you touched on it there, that the geography that New Zealand is blessed with, it creates a very good environment to grow grass. That is ultimately, farmers are grass farmers first, and then they
processing it.
Then the cattle are processing it. So we absolutely have a really strong story to tell. And as you say, if you just went overnight, we're not going to produce that. Apart from the economic catastrophe that would cause, it will just be plugged by and it was a leakage. I think is the kind of, I think the phrase that defines this. It will be plugged by another producer somewhere else in the world, and the chances are they won't be as efficient as us.
As we've been talking, you're addressing all these sort of complex, knotty things. You're making reference to data around health, data around the relative climactic impacts of different modes of production. And I can hear, and it's natural for those who are sort of skeptical of these sort of advocacy organisations, of which yours is one, to say, A, how do you know? Or B, how can we trust the data? And that's a sort of a fair question, but it's a hard one for you to kind of get on the other side of, in a way, because so often people view anything that you commission as tainted. Like, how do you know this stuff, and where are you getting the kind of data or the research to back it up from?
Look, there is a huge world of academia out there that and there's many people who are investigating, testing doing their science on all sorts of different topics. But of course, as a sector, we do often, are required to validate some of the statements. I've just referred to the life cycle analysis. That's research we had to commission, and there isn't just a endless pot of money for scientists to go and dip into and go and do research. So, we had to be proactive there. But of course, as soon as we release it, the criticisms come that it's paid for, so it can't be trusted. And I think that is a real challenge. And again, I think it's, for me, we're always going to get that accusation leveled at us, particularly on social media. There's nothing we can do about that. But for me, I think it's the role of media to go, is it a valid point? We in this example, and we came to you guys and asked you to help us tell that story around the life cycle analysis. But, you've got world-renowned scientists doing this research on our behalf. And for anyone, who's been given an official media platform, I don't mean anyone commenting on social, but to try and discredit that research simply because of where the funding came from, ultimately it does a disservice to the scientists.
Who are some of the scientists, or what are some of the institutions we're talking about here?
I would have to go and look at that specifically, but Dr. Stuart Leggard would be one of the lead authors on it, and my understanding is, and I'm not an academic in the climate space, but I think he's well regarded, and dare I say, I hope I'm not being flippant here, but I don't think he'd be easily bought off by our sector to go and, could you go and rustle up some favourable figures? He's got a body and a lifetime of work that he's got a huge reputation based on, and this is valid science that we need to be factoring into the conversation, and so it does frustrate us when these accusations get levelled at us, and again there are also examples. There was a paper released back in 2019 from a journal called the Annals of Internal Medicine. Now, this has nothing to do with the meat industry or us, but this was more focused on health and some of the links between non-communicable diseases. And this paper's conclusion was that actually the evidence, the correlation linking red meat consumption to whether that be cancer or strokes or heart disease was weak. Before the paper had even been released, there was already a campaign to discredit it. And because they'd found one of the lead authors had done some work in the past with I think an American-based agricultural, and it was quite eye-opening. And back in 2019 to see this kind of orchestrated attempt to discredit science. I thought science was about that continual pursuit of interrogating data, and then having a good discussion about it in good faith. And so I think we should always, as long as it's got some gravitas in terms of the where it's coming from, let's include it and make it part of the discussion.
The other sort of related argument is, because this is, we talk about this as a transition, right? That we started whenever we became aware of these sort of intertwining stories in a particular position, and we're trying to get somewhere by 2050 is typically the year that's nominated, and that it will require, it's a whole of society, whole of politics kind of an issue, but the pace and the sort of way that is structured is crucial, because just as with fossil fuels, you try and flick the switch immediately, we're doomed. Like our society is currently constructed, the transport, the fuel, it doesn't work. And it's a similar thing with, there is a certain amount of our survival as a species is currently predicated on, and all the other things we like to do that, that from a tax and a nutrition perspective are predicated on the current structure of our society. We might want to go on a journey, and you've referred to that, but it cannot happen immediately. So in which case, the conversation has to be about how we get there rather than doing it immediately. What is the sort of how do you make the economic argument or an argument for the economic contribution of beef and lamb to this country?
Well, farmers are the backbone, aren't they? I think the economic argument is huge, and I think often, perhaps, we don't do a good enough job of talking about this, but it's this, agricultural exports, of which red meat or sheep and beef sector was about 10.8 billion in 2023. It employs 92,000 people directly and indirectly. If you flick the switch overnight, how do we plug that? The role it plays in rural communities, this is, and you can even start to see in areas like Tairāwhiti, where there is huge swathes of forestry coming in, which generally employs less people per hectare than a sheep and beef usage of the land. You're starting to see the impacts that this is having on rural communities. And so, but I think there is still a recognition of it amongst Kiwis. I was looking at some research that the Herald published. It was a bit of research that was on polarization, and there was some other varied topics. But one of the questions was, do you agree that a farming-based economy is good for the country? And 70% of people agreed with that, and about 8% didn't. And that was I saw that and I was like, oh, it's good. People do recognise the role that this plays, and I think they want to see the sector succeed.
So, we spent probably the majority of this podcast talking about the complexity of the stories around it. And I think about growing up, the kind of beef and lamb advertising that I saw. And it's such a different challenge. It's such a different environment to the kind of more sort of simple, more homogenous kind of environment that the organisation sprang from. How does that make your organisation's job more, sort of challenging? How do you kind of bring everyone along with, to the posture that you adopt? Because there will be people amongst it who are just, not necessarily inclined towards that approach.
I go back and go, look, is our story any different to what it was 20 years ago? And you mentioned TV advertising campaigns, and I'm going to be shameless here and plug our more recent one featuring Stacey Walker. But that advert depicts a scene that I think would be familiar to many Kiwis. It is a family having a barbecue by the beach, playing a bit of touch rugby. And that is, from a positive perspective, that is our story. That is the role it plays. When it comes to the challenges that we are being put to us, we've got to address them. We have tried to steer clear in more recent years, getting into it. Well, when we talk about this, I want to talk about it in a long form format, because you cannot explain the role that we play. We've covered, the physical environment, health environment, and the climatic environment, and we've taken 25 minutes already this afternoon,
I think,
if not more. So how do you convey all that nuance in a, you can't do it in a 30-second ad spot. You can't. So you have to take a measured view. You have to acknowledge that people have genuine concerns, and we can't dismiss them as people who are, just trying to agitate us for the sake of it. That's not happening. So we do try and take a nuanced and considered approach in how we communicate that. And for perhaps the more digestible pieces of content we focus on the positive sides, because that's where we can deliver our best messages.
Do you want to talk, actually, while we're there, about the TVCs? Because they have, for a very long time, it's been wahine athletes first and foremost. I think back to, like you said, the Everswindells like a decade ago. It's been there for longer than that again. And obviously that side of society, that side of sport, languished for a long time and is now having a real moment. What was the organisation? What grounded the organisation's decision to go in that direction, and how has that sort of, there must be some sense of validation about this, about having been there all along in a way.
Yeah, it's well, obviously, the Everswindells predate my time here, but I can tell a nice anecdote from my predecessor, Rod. And Rod Slater was once upon a time a slightly more quieter partner of the Mad Butcher with Sir Peter Leach. So they were very good friends. And one day, Sir Peter called up Rod and said, "Mate, I've just met these Olympians, these girls. They're on track to win a rowing gold medal, and no one is sponsoring them, not one person." And he went, and obviously, given a target audience for our messaging, would particularly around that iron message, was of course women, because women are more susceptible to iron deficiency. And that's really where it was born. It was a chance conversation that grew into something that I don't think he would have even expected it to grow into. Sarah Ulmer was, of course, part of that. And heading into Athens, I think the Eva Swindales and Sarah Ulmer won gold medals within an hour of each other.
Incredible hour.
And then you fast forward to Beijing. Obviously, there'll have been a significant amount of marketing that went on. But if you watch the Eva Swindales race in Beijing, they won it by a whisker, inches, if that. And again, we've been trying to track down this audio, but I understand that when it cut back to the studio here in New Zealand, the presenter said it must have been that beef and lamb. And you think, oh, can you ask for a better marketing story? So I think it's we've been there from the start as an organisation, and the latest evolution with Stacey has been really exciting. I'd like to think it's my little stamp on the story, and no doubt it will go further. We've really excitingly taken on a partnership with the NZOC, the Olympic team. So we're supporting all athletes now rather than just a handful of them. Means we also can celebrate. We'll be celebrating men and women across the team, which is different for us. But it is, and you look at the growth in women's sport across the world in recent years. It's been fantastic. But it's for me, I think the encapsulation of it all was, we've obviously got Stacey Walker as our ambassador, but I watched the final as an England fan, so it was tough watching.
That would have been real tough.
But I was watching it and Stacey scored this try, and she bounces up, and she's got this huge grin on her face, and she, of course, I was aware of the team, but she wasn't on my radar from a work perspective. And I thought, wow, she clearly loves what she does. And it was only weeks later, and we were obviously starting to work through our plans for our. And she was there on the proposal, and I was like, I think there's something that's telling me something here. So it's just a really great legacy to inherit, really.
And lastly, this podcast coming out on National Lamb Day, which what is that, and where did it come from, and how does it interact with your strategy from a communication perspective?
Yeah, so it takes place on the 15th of February, which in 1882 was when the Dunedin left Port Chalmers with the first shipment of frozen lamb. And I think, if you really think that as the starting point of the New Zealand food industry, what a journey it has been. It was the start of all food exports, really.
And you think about, like sort of in the 50s, we were one of the richest economies in the world, largely related to, the cliches off the sheep's back. Yeah, so you can kind of see how that is a real foundational date for the modern New Zealand economy in a lot of ways. Yeah,
incredible, seminal moment. So for us, the day is kind of threefold. It's one, an opportunity just to look back on that, and Kiwi ingenuity is, and I say this as a recent, it's a huge part of your identity, your ability to adapt and evolve and be inventive. Is a huge part of it. It's a time also to celebrate the farmers, the food producers who are producing our food, and celebrate them. And of course, it's a chance to sit down and whether that be literally with a farmer or in spirit with a farmer on the day, and raise a chop to them. It's meant to be very. There's no politics to it. It is just pure celebration, and I think in today's world, with everything that goes on, actually just taking a moment to sit back and just celebrate what's great about New Zealand food. And I can tell you, British is known for its cuisine, aren't we? We've got some shepherd's pie, cottage pie, more pies. New Zealand food is incredible. The New Zealand on a plate it's different level, and I was struck by it immediately as I arrived. I'm blessed that my mother-in-law, when I arrived, is a fantastic cook, so that helped. But it is the flavors, the influences, all the multicultural influences that have defined New Zealand on a plate, and then it is backed up by the most tasty food in the world. Like, it is the environment that grows it makes it tasty, and so we'll sit down next week and we'll raise a chop to them all.
Awesome. I love that expression. But hey, thanks so much for coming up, Kit, and for being so sort of candid and willing to kind of embrace those questions, because they have sort of played on my mind when I see the sort of the way that these things are typically framed or discussed, and to get a sense of how an organisation like yours confronts the complexities of this modern communication environment. I think it's really interesting. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on The Fold today. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today. The Spinoff Podcast Network.